Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter O'Haney, the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And I want to say hello and welcome to everybody. And I want you to welcome our guest this evening, Derritt Mason. Hello, Derritt. How are you?
Hello, I'm wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. This is a real honor and a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for being here. Where are we finding you this evening?
I am in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, also known as Treaty 7 territory, the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. So yeah, pleasure to be joining you from here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here, and we're thrilled to talk about your book, Queer Anxieties and Young Adult Literature and Culture, which is here. And so we will get into that. Just to let everybody know a few things about Stonewall, we've been around since 1973, and we're one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the United States. We have over 27,000 volumes in our library, which they say makes it the largest LGBTQ library in the entire world. In addition, in our archive, we have 2,400 linear feet of archival materials. And just to understand what that means, that would take you all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. And if you imagine single space gay history all the way up page by page, it's over 6 million pages of gay history, mostly from 1950 to the present day. Individual people's papers, serials, all sorts of different things, even RuPaul's bathrobe and Ricky Martin's leather pants. There's no shortage of interesting finds that we have there in the archive. And so if you are here in South Florida, please come by and see us. We're open Monday through Friday and even some hours on Saturday as well too. And so we're more than happy to have you. I want to say hello to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's there behind the scenes. And Paula, hello, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks.
Nice to see you. Paula will make sure that we will all be on the straight and narrow here and everything will be under control. Paula is our digital asset manager. And so we have a big grant from the Mellon Foundation, and we are in the process of digitizing 3 big tranches of things in the archives. And so Paula has been overseeing that work, and we hope to set a date very soon about when we're going to start releasing some of that material. So Paula, thank you for all the work that you've been doing on that part of Stonewall. For those of you who are here in South Florida and you do come by, we have a number of exhibitions that we do on a regular basis. Right now we have a show called Misinformation, which is looking at the similarities between the early days of HIV and AIDS and the beginning of the COVID crisis 2 years ago. And it's phenomenal to go through the gay archives and see all those things that happened and those rumors and misinformation that was spread in 1981, 82, 83, 84 about that. And so please come by and see that. Next week, we'll be opening a new exhibition called Outright. And for those of you who don't know, Outright was a national conference that happened mostly in the 1990s, first in San Francisco and then in Boston, happened for about 9 years. And it was a way in which LGBTQ writers were able to meet and talk to each other and learn about publishing and learn that it was okay to actually create gay-themed books. Up until that time, there was not a large body of LGBTQ literature out there. But in the 90s, everything blew open. That's why you can have a library today with 27,000 books in it, because things really did blow up at that time. But thanks to our friends at Outright, we will be doing an exhibition about speeches and excerpts from speeches from the 1990s that were very, very pivotal to gay people's writing at that time. So that show will open next week, and so please come by and see that. Having a weird thing on my screen here. Let me just get rid of that. I also want to say thank you to our friends at Our Fund, which is an LGBTQ community organization or community foundation here in Fort Lauderdale. And they're the ones who make this series possible. Also, I want to say, again, if you are anywhere here in Florida, we have probably one of the largest exhibitions we've ever put together called Queer History. It's at Nova Southeastern University in Davie, Florida. There are over 125 objects in the show, and we trace LGBTQ history all the way from 1937 up until March 29, 2022, when Governor DeSantis signed the Don't Say Gay bill. And so it looks at the ups and downs and what have happened. And clearly with that last piece, we are at a down. And so it's an important piece of LGBTQ history to see, as well as American history and cultural history. But because of course, LGBTQ history is in many ways American cultural history of the 20th century. And so that again will be at Nova Southeastern University, and that is up until June 6th. Finally, I just want to say that Pride Month will be coming up in June, and we're getting a call a week right now. I'm sorry, a call a day right now for people who are looking for exhibitions or talks. And so if we can help you in any way, we're sending an exhibition to Toledo, to a pottery barn, to a temple in Connecticut. So they're going out in all sorts of different ways, but go to stonewall-museum.org and you will find out everything about us and how to get in touch with us. And also you'll be able to find some of the past participants in this series and some of the future people who we have lined up as well. For this talk, it will last just an hour. We'll have to stop at 7:30. And if you have questions or comments, please feel free to throw them into the chat or the Q&A, and Derritt and I will get to them as we go through the presentation. So please feel free to add anything that you want to. And also, I just want to do a shout out to our friends on Facebook. We get many people who watch these shows there, and so thank you for paying attention to us. So I think that's all the business I have to do here. So Derritt, back to you. So how did you end up in Calgary?
I moved to Alberta in 2009 to start graduate school to do my PhD, and the University of Alberta is in the city of Edmonton. And shortly thereafter, I got an academic job down here in Calgary at the University of Calgary. So that's the short version of it. Work brought me here.
Yeah. And what are you teaching there?
I'm an associate professor in the English department, and my primary area is children's and young adult literature. That's what I was hired to teach, but I'd say I have secondary specialties in gender and sexuality studies, queer theory, and cultural and media studies as well.
Great. Well, if you have a project to work on anytime in the near future, please reach out. We'll be happy to welcome you to Stonewall and to do some research in our archive as well.
I'd love to do that. Yeah, no, I'd love to visit sometime. Thank you.
Great. Great. So tell us a little bit about queer anxieties and young adult literature and culture. How did this book come about?
Yeah, so this book started as my PhD dissertation. I started my PhD, as I mentioned, in 2009, and originally the project was going to be quite different. I had developed an interest during my master's in queer youth cultural production, so I did a master's project that was on Toronto-based queer youth digital film project, and my PhD project was originally going to be an extension of that. But then, as I'll describe in a moment in the reading I'm going to do from the introduction, the years when I was starting my PhD, so 2009, 2010, 2011, ended up being a really pivotal moment in the development, I'd argue, of queer young adult literature. And so in those years, we see, again, I'll point this out in the reading in just a little bit, but the emergence of the It Gets Better anti-bullying project. We see much more visibility of queer characters in the media, generally speaking, and also a surge in the publication of queer young adult literature. And so as I was in the initial phases of my dissertation, I thought, this is kind of too interesting a moment to not write about. So that is how the project kind of took shape. It was originally very much focused on literature, on print literature. And then over the years, after I finished my PhD and came back to the project to kind of revise and expand it became about queer youth literature, queer young adult literature and culture a little bit more broadly than it was originally conceived, just because there were now so many interesting texts to write and think about.
So do you have any sense of queer young adult literature when you were a preteen or a teen?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in many ways, the roots of this project are deeply personal, simply because there was such an absence of visible queer representation. I mean, I can certainly think of ways I identified queerly with texts like Disney films, for example, or The Wizard of Oz. Or, as I got a little bit older, there started to be a little bit more visibility in terms of like the American Queer as Folk series. One of the first kind of out gay characters I remember on TV was Jack on Dawson's Creek when I'd be watching that in high school. But otherwise, I think a lot of this project came out of or the desire to undertake this project came out of a nostalgic, retrospective search for myself as a young queer person in books that are being published in a contemporary time.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to do this kind of work without putting a personal lens on it and the experience that we do. And of course, that's what brings great authenticity to the research that we do, is when we are able to present our own point of view in the work as well. I think really adds a lot to it. I was trying to think of, as I was asking that question, thinking about, what young queer characters I would have thought about in, I think my first sense of a queer character probably goes back to Disney as well too, and it was probably the film Pinocchio, because there was certainly something queer about that character. There was certainly an otherness about that character, and also wanting to be a boy and wanting to be accepted, or even the way he was vilified when he went to the Isle of Lost Boys and those kind of things. There was definitely queerness to all of that, which I guess I hadn't really thought about till the moment.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of fantastic scholars who have written on the queerness of Disney animated film, simply because there were a lot of queer people working in Disney studios. My colleague Pete Kunze has a fantastic book upcoming about this very topic. But there are other folks like Sean Griffin, for example, has a book called, I'm going to not remember the title correctly, but Tinkerbells and something else. But it's all about the queerness of Disney villains and Disney cartoons, and how so many, I think, young queer people connected with both villains, or as you described, the protagonists of Disney films in different ways. Tinkerbells and Evil Queens, I think is what it's called, by Sean Griffin. Yeah.
Yeah, Tinkerbell's. I'll keep an eye out for that. Well, I understand you have a presentation here. Why don't we use that as a way of sort of launching into some of our questions and conversation here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to do a really, really brief, under 10-minute reading from the introduction that I think will contextualize the project a little bit. And I have a couple slides too, so it won't be too long. Sure, is that visible, hopefully, to everyone?
You're good.
Perfect. So as I mentioned, I really started this work, undertaking this research in 2010, 2011, when a lot of these main events were happening. And when I was revisiting it to turn it into a book, it became a little bit of a historical, even though, 10 years ago isn't necessarily that historical, but I was really rethinking what was happening as I was starting this project, and coming to the conclusion that those years were actually quite pivotal when it came to queer young adult literature and queer youth representation. So I just have a little bit from the introduction that will contextualize this a little bit more for everyone. So the years 2010 to 2011 marked a noteworthy turning point in contemporary queer YA discourse. And in the book, I use queer YA as a shorthand for not only queer young adult literature, but queer texts about and for queer youth more broadly. It was during this time that we saw the longer history of anxiety and adolescence collide with contemporary concerns about queer youth and the content of text for young people. Moreover, these conversations and cultural shifts related to queer youth seem to have had a very real impact on rapid subsequent growth in queer YA publishing. Here are 3 scenes that set the stage. So scene 1, September 2010. Suddenly, it seems, the media is saturated with images of young queers who are taking their own lives, driven to tragic extremes by relentless bullying. In the span of 3 weeks, 5 American teens kill themselves. Their names are manifest in print and digital ink, newspapers, magazines, and online memorials. Billy Lucas, Asher Brown, Seth Walsh, Raymond Chase. And in perhaps the most widely publicized case, Tyler Clementi, the Rutgers University student who leaps to his death from the George Washington Bridge after his roommate records footage of Clementi's sexual encounter with another man. NBC News reports suicide surge. Celebrity blogger Perez Hilton declares that America is in crisis. Although sociologists, healthcare workers, and educators have perceived queer teens as being at risk of suicide for decades, it seems that for the first time since Matthew Shepard's Torture and Murder in 1998, the general public is being made aware of the multiple forms of quotidian violence many young queers confront. Students fight difficult battles for the right to form gay-straight alliances at their schools. Community leaders initiate anti-bullying policy and legislation reform. And on September 21st, the day before Tyler Clementi would take his own life, writer Dan Savage and his partner, Terry Miller, launched the It Gets Better project, which invites adults to submit videos that offer messages of hope and encouragement to gay teens. As the It Gets Better website states, the It Gets Better project was created to show young LGBT people the levels of happiness, potential, and positivity their lives will reach if they can just get through their teen years. The It Gets Better project wants to remind teenagers in the LGBT community that they are not alone, and it will get better. Before the end of It Gets Better's first week, 1,000 videos have been uploaded to the project's YouTube channel. Okay, this is the second scene. September 28th, 2011. In an interview on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's talk show Q, young adult authors Rachel Manisha Brown and Sherwood Smith claimed that literary agents asked them to de-gay their novel to make it more marketable. In response, Brown and Smith go public. There is a very real issue in young adult novels that there are very, very few books with gay characters, Smith asserts. Brown speaks at length about how she perceives fiction as having the power to save lives. I think that when you cut certain types of people out of fiction, you're sending the message to teenagers saying that what they are inherently is so terrible that it can't be talked about and can't be portrayed. And I think that's really soul crushing. There have been a number of gay teen suicides. LGBTQ teenagers do have a much higher suicide rate because of prejudice, and I don't want to add to that prejudice. The Q interview is a follow-up to a post by Brown and Smith on the Publisher's Weekly blog entitled Say Yes to Gay YA, which receives the greatest number of single-day hits in the website's history and draws over 40,000 views in 3 days, as well as a defensive response from the agents in question. We would love to start this conversation, writes Joanna Stampfel-Volt of the Nancy Coffey Literary Agency. Let's discuss. Third and final scene, October 9th, 2011. In a New York Times op-ed entitled No More Adventures in Wonderland, Maria Tatar decries the current state of children's literature as being too dark, too violent, too lacking in imaginative play. I'm quoting here. It is hard not to mourn the decline of the literary tradition invented by Lewis Carroll and J.M. Barrie, she writes, arguing that the Harry Potter, His Dark Materials, and Hunger Games series deliver unto children, quote, an unprecedented dose of adult reality, sometimes without the redemptive beauty, cathartic humor, and healing magic of an earlier time. If only contemporary authors spent as much time with children as Carroll and Barrie did, Tatar asserts, their books would better reflect what children actually want in their stories. She concludes that unlike other authors, Carroll and Barrie, and I'm quoting here again, fully entered the imaginative worlds of children, where danger is balanced by enchantment, and reproduce their magic on the page. In today's stories, those safety zones are rapidly vanishing as adult anxieties edge out childhood fantasy. So the messages from these 3 scenes. Queer youth are in crisis. Publisher constraints are limiting young adult literature's effectiveness as a potential remedy. The genre of children's literature, more generally, is doing the wrong thing. Together, these 3 examples evince persistent anxieties about what children and youth are doing and reading, how what they read affects what they do, and how adult concerns and desires shape stories for young people. One product of these anxieties, it appears, was a boom in queer YA publishing. As Jenkins and Cart report in Representing the Rainbow, a 2018 book, an updated version of an older title called The Heart Has Its Reasons, 10 young adult titles with LGBTQ plus content were published in the 1970s, 40 in the 1980s, 82 in the 1990s, 292 in 2000 to 2009, and 513 titles in 2010 to 2016. Similarly, as seen in this graph, Melinda Lowe indicates that the number of LGBTQ YA books released annually by mainstream publishers more than quadrupled over a span of 2 decades, surging from fewer than 20 titles per year in the early 2000s to nearly 80 in 2016, 84 in 2017, and 108 in 2018. Lowe's statistics reveal a striking uptick in 2010 to 2012, when the number of titles published annually climbed from approximately 10 to 35 and then continued to skyrocket. So in these examples that I've provided, we see the longer history of anxious young adult criticism gaining cultural momentum through its intersection with queer youth advocacy. Simultaneously, Maria Tatar's critique from the New York Times, although not explicitly invested in queer issues, speaks to enduring concerns about how adults address young people through literature. These are the same anxieties articulated by Carton Jenkins in Representing the Rainbow and their other books, and they appear particularly intense when it comes to questions about how sexuality, in particular queer sexuality, should be represented in text for young audiences. When hope and happiness seem absent from the queer popular imagination, when children's literature trends dark and disturbing, and when adolescents appear to be in crisis, many among us become quite anxious. Queer young adult literature and cultural texts that seek to address queer youth proliferate as both an anxiety management strategy, so a potential antidote to the fact that queer youth are in crisis, and a producer of additional anxiety. What if this address fails in its mission? These persistent yet shifting anxieties should be recognized as generative, constitutive characteristics of queer YA and its commentary. Conversations about young people and the texts they do or do not, should or should not consume, provide a useful lens for parsing a network of affective relations that has long haunted the histories of adolescence and literature for young people. And so then I kind of go on from there to argue that what I'm really trying to do in this book is reshape the way we think of what I call queer YA, so queer young adult literature, but also text for and about queer youth more broadly. And I want to take what has been traditionally written about as a body of print literature, so print books, print literature for young people, and think about how we can open this up a little bit and think more across media by thinking not in terms of kind of content or theme, so not books for queer young people about queer young people, but rather a set of affective relations. So what does it mean to think about what brings these texts together is not necessarily literary genre, but how anxiety seems to accumulate around these texts. And that kind of opened things up a little bit to take us beyond, again, print literature and into other things I talk about in the book. So video games, animated television, web projects, fan fiction, all I see as being part of this broader thing that I call queer YA that is more about affect than content. And I have a breakdown of the chapters of the book if that's helpful at all, or I didn't know if you want me to pause here for questions.
Let's pause.
Yeah.
Let's pause
Sure.
here for a second. We actually let's keep the graph up on the screen.
Sure.
Because we actually have a question about the graph itself, which is about the dip that happened in 2010. And then sort of the big skyrocketing where it looked as if, we're talking about mainstream publishers here from 2003 to 2009. And then there was that drop off in 2010 before it rose again. Any explanation of the rationale for that dip?
No, I actually don't. I don't know how to account for the dip. It might have just been a year where there weren't a lot of queer YA texts, in the pipelines, for example. And this is still around the time where authors are like the authors I mentioned in my introduction, Sherwood Smith and Rachel Manisha Brown, are coming out to say that publishers are actually limiting queer content in books for young people, right? Authors are actively being asked to de-gay books because the fear is that they won't be more marketable. And then shortly after that, when these conversations start happening, you see this real explosion in young adult content. So I'm not really sure how to explain the dip, but my theory is mostly on why we see an explosion after 2010 in queer content in books for young people.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, and but importantly, by looking at the rise here from 2003 to 2016 in this graph, I think is a very important thing. I see someone has raised their hand, and just if you have a question or a comment, just throw it into the chat and the Q&A, and we'll process it. We'll process it as we go through here. So as we pull back and look a little bit at some of the stuff in more detail, talk a little bit about queer sexuality in teens and about the idea of queerness versus the idea of sexual acts, and sort of differentiating between sexual acts and discussion about sexual acts versus sexual orientation, and how some of that may have some fears about that if we're going to talk about gender identification or sexuality, that some people hear those words as being sexual conduct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the answer, there are a lot of kind of complex layers in there that need to be unpacked, especially because something I think can be queer without necessarily having a gay identified or queer identified character in it. And I mean, for example, we were just talking about, Disney films, for example, something like The Little Mermaid, where Ursula, it's been discussed a number of times that Ursula the Sea Witch was modeled after the famous drag queen Divine, because you had a number of, again, queer people behind the scenes working on that project. But there's no kind of out gay or lesbian or trans character in The Little Mermaid, and yet we could make the argument that The Little Mermaid is a queer film because it has these queer resonances. So first, I think there's a distinction that a number of queer theorists, in addition to myself, make between queerness and LGBTQ representation. That's something that happens in the book. And then there are these questions about like identity versus sexuality. And I think a great event or conversation that really puts this into perspective is there's a queer young adult book released in Canada by a Canadian author named Raziel Reed in I'm probably going to get the year wrong, 2014 or 2015, called When Everything Feels Like the Movies. And this book was enormously controversial because of how successful it was. So it won the Governor General's Literary Award for children's literature, which is Canada's most prestigious literary award. And it is about an openly queer character and contains descriptions of queer or gay sex. And this was part of the massive controversy. And, the conservative critics really came out of the woodwork to say this award should be rescinded. There was a petition, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, what these conversations ignored is that, sex has been represented in young adult literature actually for decades, just not necessarily queer sex to the same extent, right? Like Judy Blume was writing about sex in young adult literature in the 70s. So the idea of sex being represented is nothing new. So it really, I think, pointed out how there was a lot of support for, identity being represented. So an openly gay character who just happens to be gay and, the sexuality isn't really part of the story. But as soon as you bring actual sex into the picture, people really get quite anxious.
Yeah, and again, I think that is adult anxiety as opposed to youth anxiety that's happening. And it leads me to my next question about the second quote that you had here about Rachel Brown. And I just want to underscore this again, where Rachel says, I think that when you cut certain types of people out of fiction, you're sending the message to teenagers saying that they are inherently so terrible that it can't be talked about and it can't be portrayed. And I think that's really soul crushing. Yes, thank you for putting that back up there.
Of course.
So it leads to the obvious comparison that those of us here in Florida and in other states where we see laws being put into place that sexual orientation and gender identity are topics that cannot even be discussed or have to be discussed with permission before that information can actually be shared. Any insight on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it really puts into perspective is the power of representation and how representation is such a political thing. Like the very utterance of the word gay in some contexts is now seen as such a threat that there has to be this blanket silence put over everything. I think something I try to do in the book that when I started writing it, I think there was a ton of emphasis on the importance of representation and visibility, which again, I 100% agree with. And what I try to do in the book is push beyond that a little bit and say that it doesn't kind of end at representation and visibility, because there are all these other ways that queerness can circulate in text, and a number of ways that queer readers can make a text, even that doesn't seem queer on the surface, their own and form a powerful connection with it. But I think that, now with things like Don't Say Gay happening, it really brings representation back to the foreground where, we see how important representation is, simply because it is deemed to be such a politically threatening thing. So therefore it becomes all the more important to be able to, represent LGBTQ folks. Other marginalized folks, as much as possible in the media and in cultural texts, et cetera.
Yeah, and it also just gets to the point where it it makes things so much more literal, where they don't necessarily have to be. It kind of erases any kind of abstraction that we can find, which of course is a great way that we can take information. And we have a question here from Robert, who asks whether or not you know how many other LGBTQ characters appeared in other media, such as film and television, over that same period that we had in that other graph. So I think the point of the question here is, as we're charting out in that graph about young adult queer stories, was this also a period of time in which gay characters were blossoming in other areas, presumably for adult audiences, but even on TV and film and other things that would end up being seen by younger people?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I don't have specific numbers, but I did actually just publish another article, which is specifically on this topic. And it's called Resurrecting Paranorman, Ghosts and Gays in the Nuclear Cartoon. And it's a look at queer representation in children's animated film and television. And I looked specifically at the animated film Paranorman, which was released in the year 2012, so right around this time. And there's a supporting character named Mitch in the film Paranorman, who was hailed as the first openly gay, even though he comes out at the end of the film, spoiler alert, I'm sorry if you haven't seen it, as having a boyfriend, but doesn't necessarily self-identify as gay. And the joke is it's kind of like a punchline, because he's kind of this, beefy, dopey jock who you wouldn't kind of necessarily associate with a stereotypical representation of gayness. And he comes out at the end of the film as having a boyfriend. And this was like a huge, again, cultural moment. People were like, this is the first time there's been an openly gay character in a children's film. And of course, there was all kinds of conservative backlash as well. But in this article, I actually trace how, Paranorman marked, similar to what I'm doing here with young adult literature, an interesting cultural moment in children's animated film. You had some representation in animated television, so I'm thinking of like Steven Universe, for example, but it was really kind of like post-Paranorman that we're starting to see more and more openly queer representation in children's media more broadly. But film, I think, children's animated film is still, really, it's like a touchy issue. And this has come to light lately with like Disney and censorship issues in China and everything like that, right? So yeah, you have, the little, gay moment at the end of the Beauty and the Beast remake, for example, although that's not an animated film, it's a children's film. You have things like Netflix's The Mitchells versus the Machines, which came out last year, which has an openly queer protagonist, young female protagonist. So there is, it's gradually expanding around, in these years, 2010 to 2012, which are kind of a pivotal moment. Yeah.
Great. I know you have some more slides. Let's go through those, and then maybe we can move on with the rest of the book.
Yeah, so I just really, in terms of contextualizing the book a little further, wanted to provide a breakdown of how the chapters function in the book. So the table of contents I also call the sites of anxiety. So essentially every chapter of the book explores a different critical space in discourse about queer YA, where I've noted there's a fair amount of critical anxiety on a certain topic. So chapter 1 looks at specifically what we've been talking a lot about, visibility. So what it means to have an openly, LGBTQ identified character in a text, and the kind of critical push for that. Chapter 2 looks at risk and narratives of at-risk youth. Yes, please.
Let me interrupt you here. And so some of these early queer titles, and when you speak about the anxiety of youth, what have you seen about sort of general teenage or preteen anxiety versus straight kids or queer kids, or even questioning kids? I mean, is the anxiety level higher?
Yeah, so something I get at in the book is that the different kind of shapes that anxiety is taking in not only the texts themselves, but in conversations about the books and the texts. So one type of anxiety is the kind of critical anxiety I've been describing, which is a type of adult anxiety about what's being represented in these texts and what young people might be potentially learning from them. But I also look at the young protagonists themselves. And in the introduction, I trace, there's like a long, I describe how the history of adolescence is also a kind of history of anxiety, because adolescence really emerged as a cultural category at the turn of the 20th century when G. Stanley Hall wrote this massive multi-volume tome called Adolescents, in which he delineates the different characteristics of adolescence and also offers this very kind of racist and colonial theory of what he calls recapitulation, where he argues that the human development basically mirrors the development of the human species from kind of primitive savagery into civilization. And of course, he's also only talking about male adolescents in this case. But something that remains very formative that Hall did was he coined storm and stress via the German Sturm und Drang, which is the quality of adolescence, where we think of adolescence being kind of like emotional turmoil and chaos and everything like that, that still kind of lingers and haunts adolescence today. So I looked at how kind of adolescence emerged as both an anxious construct, but also out of this kind of adult anxiety to, if we create and name this category, we can also control it, right? That's why age categories often get invented, childhood, adolescence. Historically, it's out of like, okay, if we can describe this thing, then we can also kind of manage it and ensure it doesn't get too unruly. Sorry, I'm getting off track here, but what I'm trying to say is that the young protagonists in these books, especially in chapter 1, chapter 2, where I'm looking at older queer young adult titles, I'm really interested in the temporality of anxiety. So there's a psychoanalyst named Adam Phillips who talks about worry and anxiety is having a very specific kind of relation to time, where we're trying to freeze the present while still looking forward to the future, right? So when we're worried or anxious about something, often it's because we're worried about something down the road happening. So Phillips talks about how worry and anxiety are actually an ironic form of hope, because if we're worried, even if we're worried about the future, it still means that we believe in a future. And so I'm interested in how, the characters of these books, their actions kind of mirror the temporality of anxiety. So not anxiety necessarily in the storm and stress sense, but anxiety in the sense of like trying to freeze the present while looking forward to the future.
Yeah, and then I think on top of it, to complicate it with some of these early titles, I mean, you talk about some of the early books for queer youth going back to 1969 and 1972. In some ways, they mirrored what was happening in a lot of other queer fiction, adult fiction at the time, and that there in even films and definitely through the 50s and into the 60s, but self-loathing, loneliness, isolation, those were the tropes and the ideas that about homosexuality in general that were sort of permeating all of these forms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really great chapter in a book by Sarah Ahmed, the cultural critic. Her book's called The Promise of Happiness, and the chapter is called Unhappy Queers. And she describes the very real, again, publishing pressures on queer authors, not just queer writers for young people, but queer authors who are imagining an adult audience, where publishers wouldn't let them write happy endings into their stories. So, and again, the rationale was, queers in real life, especially queer young people, can't be out and live a happy life. Therefore, if we delude them into thinking that they're able to do so through fiction, this will actually harm them. And you see that a lot in a lot of queer writers who were writing for young people in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I mean, even today describe that, which is why there's, the trope of barrier queers or barrier gays that we see, right? A queer character has to be killed off. A queer character has to, die in a car accident or be horrifically maimed or whatever, because they can't have a happy ending. So to a certain degree, I think that, another argument I make in the book is that we see a lot of these anxieties around children's literature and queerness in general, but they're particularly intensified or magnified when it comes to young people. So I think that, the de-gaying that Sherwood Smith and Rachel Brown describe as part of that longer legacy of not being able to give queers happy endings or represent happiness or hope and everything like that. But also I think, truthfully, books of that era, like a lot of the sadness and loneliness came from a kind of truth of the kind of lives that a lot of people, queer people, were living. And that's not to say that there wasn't joy and community and liveliness as well, but there was also, cultural conditions that produced loneliness and sadness, just like there are today, right?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, not to go too far down that path, but I mean, in 1969, the American Psychiatric Association was still declaring that homosexuality was a deformity or a deviation. And so, there were plenty of reasons for people to feel sad about it. Let's move on to chapter 3, where you talk about HIV and AIDS and how that first made an appearance in young adult books and how that was dealt with.
Yeah, so absolutely. So what I do, HIV/AIDS, as you can probably imagine, is a source of huge anxiety for, children's, I think, culture in general. And a lot of, to this day, this remains a fact where young adult literature and children's literature tend to really displace HIV/AIDS when it comes to young protagonists. So, in books in the 80s, 90s through today, often, if there was a character who was HIV positive or who had AIDS, it was the protagonist's uncle or older brother or a teacher or another family member. It was never a young protagonist themselves, despite the fact that, HIV continues to affect thousands and thousands of youth around the world to this very day. And if a young protagonist did have or was HIV positive, it was often for the mode of transmission was unrealistic or medically highly unlikely. So there were HIV positive young protagonists who happened to become HIV positive through a blood transfusion, for example. And this would take place in books even after the blood supply had been deemed safe for a really long time. So then you have books where the character it'll be set in a different country, or books about HIV today that are set, that now back in the 80s or 90s. So it's HIV is actually a thing of the past. It doesn't continue to exist today. So there's this displacement, this temporal, historical, spatial displacement of HIV onto other characters, other times, other parts of history. And so I get into that a little bit, and I look at this book from the young adult boom. So, it was published in 2013, David Levithon's Two Boys Kissing, which interestingly enough is set in the present day, but it's narrated by a chorus of ghostly, they're called the shadow uncles. So kind of this ghostly chorus of men who died during the worst of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. And they're kind of reflecting on the state of queer youth today. And I put that book into conversation with a video game, the first ever queer video game, as it's known, Caper and the Castro, which was released in 1989, which is this detective. You play a detective named Tracker McDyke who has to solve a series of mysteries. And the game was created as charityware. So it was created to raise money for HIV/AIDS charities by its creator, CM Ralph. And yet HIV/AIDS strangely isn't part of the game, but there's a kind of metaphor in the game where one of the mysteries you have to solve is that there's this villain named Dulligan Straight Man who's trying to poison the Castro's queer community with a lethal bacteria that's going to be put into all of the drinks in the Castro district. So I look at how these two texts both engage in a kind of HIV or displacement of HIV/AIDS, whereas HIV/AIDS is still kind of very much at their center. And I talk about, questions of failure and affective forms of hopelessness and things like that.
It's totally fascinating. I had a question about whether or not failure or Caper and the Castro is still available for people as a game.
It is available. And the cool thing is, what got me excited about this is when I was revising the book, there's a really, really fantastic website called the LGBTQ Game Archive, which was founded by a scholar named Adrian Shaw. And this game or this website collects every type of queer representation in video games through the years. And they did some research and dug up the fact that Caper and the Castro once existed, and through networking, they were able to kind of resurrect it. And so the game is playable. If you go to the LGBTQ Game Archive, then there's a link and you can play the game on the archive.org site. And this also recently happened to another early queer game from '92 called Gay Blade, which I'm actually writing about right now, which was featured in a Netflix documentary called High Score, which is like Dungeons and Dragons, but with it's nicknamed Dungeons and Drag Queens because you play as like a little queer entourage, and you go into this dungeon, you have to kill all these like homophobic like monsters. Like, yeah.
Great. That's great. And so Paula, thank you for throwing, I was going to ask you the LGBTQ game archive. Thank you for throwing that up here so people can see that, because I think it would be great to look back on some of these and to be able to see it. We do have a question here from Owen, who was wondering, of the books published prior to 2010, how much diversity is there in the queer storylines? And is there a change in the narrative as we continue into the current time period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is definitely a blind spot of my archive in the book, and also a blind spot of children's and young adult literature more broadly, which is that historically, children's and young adult literature is just frankly like not a very diverse body of text, especially when it comes to the representation of race. There's a really fantastic study that was done, I believe in 2015 and then again in 2018, that looked at children's books and shows that in children's books there are actually more animals, trucks, toys, and objects represented in children's books than there are people of color combined. So, I mean, this has been steadily improving, but I wouldn't say that children's young adult literature is really, there's a lot of work to be done. And we can see that organizations like We Need Diverse Books, for example, have been started to point to the absence of representation in children's young adult literature. So yes, when it comes to, this was a challenge when it came to looking especially at the historical queer young adult books. Most of them are white, cis, gay, middle-class, male protagonists. It's really not until recent years that starts to get challenged a little bit, and we see more trans protagonists, protagonists of color, non-binary, gender fluid protagonists. So this is something that historically has, definitely been an issue and continues to be an issue in children's young adult lit.
Well, at least it's good that publishers are making that work available for children today, and for families to have that work, where that work was probably available before, but it was probably difficult for people to get it published. So let's move on to some of the other chapters here.
Sure. Yeah. So chapter 4. So the other thing that was happening around 2012-ish was there was a surge in dystopian literature for young people. So this is when we have the Hunger Games trilogy, when we have Divergent, when we have Maze Runner, and all of the film franchises that come out of that. And so we saw a little bit of that bleeding over into queer young adult literature, with Andrew Smith's Grasshopper Jungle, which is the text I write about in this chapter, but also in broader discussions about young adult literature, and has it become too dark? Has it become too disturbing, given this surge in dystopian text? So I kind of look at Grasshopper Jungle as an interesting book that both parodies this kind of hyperbolic anxiety about dystopian representation in young adult literature, and also anxiety around the sexuality of young people, but also does this funny thing where the protagonist is obsessed with describing absolutely everything in excruciating detail. And he's kind of involved in a love triangle with his gay identified best friend and his girlfriend. And everything is described in detail except for the sleepover that he has with his gay best friend. So the text both like literalizes in painful detail, every aspect of this young boy's life, except for that one moment. So I kind of talk about that iron mirror paradox in chapter 4 as something that I call the unbearable, after great work done by the late Lauren Berlant and Lee Edelman. Then in the remaining sites of anxieties are horror and camp. So in chapter 5, I look at the Netflix animated series Big Mouth, which takes the anxieties surrounding puberty and creates literal monsters out of them. And chapter 6 looks at the It Gets Better project, which again, as I mentioned, came out or was founded in 2010, 2011 by Dan Savage and Terry Miller. And then in chapter 7, I look at fan fiction that mashes up the It Gets Better project with the TV show Glee, which again was tremendously popular in kind of the early 2010s, and look at how young people themselves, young authors of fan fiction, are intervening in these conversations about representation and how queer youth are being represented in various forms of media. Yes, and then I have just a very brief conclusion that looks at, again, around the same time, there were some editorials in the New Yorker and New York Times that were ruminating on adult fascination with young adult literature, and kind of coming to the conclusion that adults shouldn't read books for young people because it's a sign of immaturity, and everyone should kind of graduate to adult books, et cetera, et cetera. And so I kind of take that up in the context of queer young adult literature as well.
Yeah, so let's, do you have any more on your screen here?
That is, I believe, the end of my slideshow. So I'm
Great.
happy to, I can stop sharing.
Yeah, okay. That way we can see a bit better. So I do think it's interesting too, when we think about young adult literature, that in parts of your book, you do also seem, and you just mentioned it some, about intentionally blurring some of the lines of where young adults are getting information and fiction. And so it's not just through literature, it's not just through the object of a book itself, but it's through games and it's through television. And it's recognizing the fact that kids and teens can get queer stories or evaluate themselves vis-a-vis queer stories through the other forms of information that or ways that they're taking information in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are a number of kind of ironies bound up in how we typically imagine young adult literature and children's literature. One of the things about young adult literature that I find particularly interesting is that there was a great Publishers Weekly study done in 2012. So it's 10 years old at this point. I'd be curious to see a new one done that found that actually the vast majority of readers of young adult literature are not young adults. They're adults. And not only are they adults, but they're between the ages of I think it was 26 or 29 and 40. So, not teenagers, not young adults, but fully fledged adults. They're the biggest buyers of young adult literature and they're buying for themselves. So, it raises this question of, we have this thing called young adult literature, but in fact, most of the people who are reading it arguably are not even young adults. So then the question becomes, well, where are young adults? Where are they going? I'm sure, many of them are reading young adult literature, but also adult literature. Also, as you mentioned, television programs, films, there's the internet, right? So one of the ironies that strikes me about, how bound up adults are or often are about what young people are reading, they might not even be reading the things that you think they're reading, right? There are all of these kind of assumptions that go along with just publishing categories, as they're often described. So,
yeah, and just to your point, I learned today that in one of our book clubs, the assignment for 2 weeks from now is All Boys Aren't Blue and Lawn Boy. And so it's actually the first time that two young adult books have been assigned to this adult group. And of course, both of those books are books which have been widely banned because of the content. And let me ask you a little bit about, sort of touching on what I asked before about the Don't Say Gay, but now it's sort of national. It seems as if there is definitely a movement afoot to remove a lot of young adult literature from schools and libraries. And the list of banned books is really longer, it seems, than it has been in a while, particularly for young adult books. What do you think that's about?
I mean, I think it's this anxiousness about young people. And again, these aren't new anxieties, right? There have been anxieties surrounding what people are doing for literal centuries. But it is really interesting if you go to the American Library Association's website, you can get lists of the most commonly banned and challenged books. And I always show this to my children's literature students at the start of the term, just to make this point about the political, social work of children's literature and how it's often perceived to be threatening. Most of there are banned and challenged books that are not necessarily categorized by genre, but I think it's in the top 10 or 15, the first 8 or something. I'm making these numbers up, you have to go look for yourself, but the vast majority of them are young adult or children's books, right? Or picture books. So Tango Make 3, for example, the notorious gay penguins book. And then you have things Harry Potter, Catcher in the Rye, To Kill a Mockingbird, things that young people have been reading in schools for decades and decades. And yeah, I think it's just, a reiteration of very, very old anxieties around what children are reading, and it involves just tremendous projection on the part of adults, right? Because the adults who are wanting to ban or challenge these books are assuming that young people are A, going to read them, B, read them in a certain way, and C, learn a very specific lesson from them or something that is counter to what the adult wants to believe in, right? So it takes a tremendous amount of, again, projection on an adult's part in order to kind of feel this way. And that's something that's interesting about children's literature to me in general, is that to a certain degree, it's all kind of even though we call it children's literature, it could also really be called like adult projection literature. Not all the time, but it's as an interesting kind of thought experiment, right? And that comes back to like this conversation we were having earlier. Even the reason I got into young adult literature, it's like, oh, I wish I had this kind of book myself as a young queer person. But this also assumes that I would respond to it a certain way and it would do a kind of work. And there's no guarantee that I would have a certain kind of response to it, but I want to kind of project that into my past self.
Yeah, I think those observations are really very on point. And also I think too, there is this adult projection and sort of this moral projection where adults are putting on these novels and having to deal with their own anxieties. But then also I think what's unfortunate is a lot of what's happening is that children are being exploited for political gain, in the sense that politicians or government leaders or thought leaders out there can go after these books simply because they believe they can find a constituency of people who want to have a negative viewpoint about it, as opposed to their real feeling about it. They're just trying to gather support. It seems, to me, it seems that that's part of what the motivation is.
Yeah, there's a really fantastic, and it's a very dense and very theoretical academic book, but it's brilliantly insightful and really transformed the field of queer studies and queer children's literature, or I should say queer childhood studies, called No Future: Queer Theory or the Death Drive by Lee Edelman. And Edelman really gets at how the child is this enormously powerful cultural and political symbol, right? And we're not talking about real children, we're talking about imaginary children. He makes the argument that politics cannot exist without a sense of the future, right? So like everything that happens in the sphere of politics is towards imagining or designing a particular kind of future. And we cannot imagine the future without the figure of the child, right? When you just look at any kind of political discourse, there's always an imaginary figurative child that's being conjured that we have to enact a certain policy in the name of, right? So this is how, for example, conservative lawmakers, I know in North American context, have argued for things a couple of years ago, like the transgender bathroom bills, or even what's happening now in the US, the horrific, political decisions that are being made around, under the guise of like protecting trans kids, right? But what it's doing is criminalizing them, right? So there's always a kind of figural, symbolic child that's being conjured in the name of some kind of political decision that actually has nothing to do with real material children.
Yeah, and of course, it's something which has just been going on for so long with regard to 20th century struggles around the gay community. If you think about what was known as the Johns Committee here in Florida, and the fact that that was in the late 1950s and early 1960s to try to keep Florida kids safe by not allowing gay men to teach in public colleges here. Or you think about Anita Bryant's work in 1977. Her organization was called Save the Children, from the wicked homosexuals out there. Or you think about QAnon, or you think about this most recent wave with Don't Say Gay. Again, they're putting children forward as saying that's what we're trying to do, is save kids. But in reality, there's no real harm. That there's no proof of any harm to kids. They're just setting it up as a villain, which is completely false.
Yeah. I mean, the child as a symbol has tremendous ideological force that often goes unquestioned, right? You can make an argument and say, oh, we're doing it for children. And a lot of people won't ever interrogate like what that actually means, or even say, well, what children? What specific, point me to the child you're actually talking about, right? But the child often functions in this really symbolic way.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left. I'm curious. I mean, you're teaching young adult literature at University of Calgary, right? So, what are your students interested in writing about today?
Oh, that's a really, really fantastic and thoughtful question. Well, the class that I taught this term was actually on video games. I'm kind of pivoting myself a little bit to, video game studies, but video game studies in conversation with children's and young adult literature. So the class I taught this term was called Video Games in the Bildungsroman, and it was all about how we can use the tools of literary analysis. So thinking about the Bildungsroman or the novel of education or the coming of age story to think through a lot of recent thematic trends in gaming. And I'm really excited by it. Students are also really, really excited by it. And I have a number of students who made games for their final projects that were really, really great. And I have noticed a trend, I think, because of the pressures of COVID and, studying under COVID and living under COVID, that a lot of students are really interested in questions of mental health and well-being. So I had 2 students who made this really fantastic paper and pencil role-playing game that was all about you play as a kind of young character who's struggling with her mental health and the various pressures of day-to-day life. I have a number of other students who wanted to look at themes surrounding mental health in games. So I think that this is a topic that's very much at the forefront of everyone's minds, given what we've all collectively experienced over the last 2+ years under COVID.
Yeah, I think that's great. And the other question that I would have too about that is that if your class of students were here, and I'm sure that they've seen your book and they've had conversations about it, but would a lot of them be scratching their heads and saying, why is there all this controversy about queer characters in young adult books? Do they not see do they not see the issue involved here?
I mean, are you asking in terms of like, because things have improved so much that
because they've lived through a period in which, in many cases, of course, we can't generalize for all of them, but they're like, why is this a big deal? Why would people even care about these stories? Are innocent, they're real, and kids should be, or teens and young adults should be able to read them.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, something I try to do in the book too, and one of the reasons I want to reclaim older queer YA texts is to avoid a narrative of progress or, perpetuating a narrative of progress which is kind of the it gets better narrative where, things are good now and they used to be bad. I mean, on a number of levels, that's true, but I also think for a lot of folks, like things haven't necessarily gotten better. And I'm thinking of, from an intersectional perspective, queer, Indigenous, Two-Spirit folks, BIPOC, queer folks, trans folks, like things haven't necessarily improved in the way that they might have for someone with a lot of privilege like me as a cis white gay man. And so I think students are very perceptive of the dimensions of intersectionality and how important it is on a representational level, but also on the level of social political change or even change within the university to keep pushing at how things are not necessarily getting better across the board.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of the answer I was fishing for there a bit, in the sense that even though some of those with privilege might feel like, what's the big deal? There's still plenty of other kids out there that these are real issues and they understand why they've been out there. Well, Derritt, it's been great to chat with you. As hours zips by faster than we know. The book, of course, is Queer Anxieties of Young Adult Literature and Culture, and you can get it, I hope, at your local independent bookstore. And of course, it's a great way. It seems like our audience has enjoyed this. They're thanking us a lot, and so that's great. So for those of you who were not able to join the whole talk, or if you have somebody who wants to see it, give us about 24 hours or 36 hours, and it will be up on our website at stonewall-museum.org. All of these talks are recorded and put on YouTube, and you can link them through our website. I want to thank our friends again at Our Fund Foundation for making this possible. And I want to say goodnight to my colleague, Paula Sierra, who's there behind the scenes, making sure everything is happening. Paula, thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Derrick, hope to see you in South Florida very soon.
Yes, I'd love that. And if I can just say thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. And to everyone who attended, I know that we're all incredibly zoomed out after the last 2 years. So it means a lot to me that, many of you came up to attend and listen. And for those of you who are watching online, thank you as well. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Good night, everybody. See you next week. And I think next week we have the Prophet. We have Robert Jones Jr. and the Prophets will be next week. So adios. Good night.